everybody. So this week we are all about the Cold War. And this is a particular area of interest of mine, so I'm going to talk to you guys a lot about what happened during the Cold War and how it affects American society. And the big questions that we're going to be looking at are, first of all, who started the Cold War, which is to say, what were some of the major conflicts? What was it all about? Why were the U.S. and the Soviet Union at odds after World War II? And then how did the Cold War affect American society at home? Because it had some pretty profound effects upon America as well. So that's really what we're going to be looking at today. So first I'm going to start off talking about, well, who started the Cold War? How do we get there? And in order to understand the Cold War, we have to understand something first about the differences between capitalism and communism. Capitalism obviously was the system under which the United States kind of operates, the economic system under which the United States operates, and communism was an economic and political system that the Soviet Union operated under. So why were these two systems opposed to each other? So I'm going to first talk very briefly about what communism is. And very often the term communism or socialism, even today, gets thrown around a lot without a very clear understanding of what it means or how it's different from capitalism. So hopefully this will clear some things up a bit. This is a very quick and dirty summary of communism. It's certainly not comprehensive, but it will hopefully give you a basic understanding. And for those of you who might have taken a political theory class, this might be old news, but for those who are coming to this material without much prior knowledge, hopefully you'll find this kind of informative. And it'll help give you kind of a sense of what we're dealing with here when we're talking about the historical events. So, first off, what is communism? And we have to start off with this spectrum here. Capitalism to socialism to communism. And we want to think about it in terms of a political spectrum. So the modern idea of communism grew out of ideas from two main figures. You had Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin. Marx was a German philosopher of the 19th century, and he wrote, among other things, the Communist Manifesto, and he develops the philosophical underpinnings of communism. Lenin, on the other hand, is a political figure. He led the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in 1918. He created the Soviet Union. He's the first guy to really put Marx's ideas into practice and create an actual government based upon them. And all communist countries have followed the pattern that was set by Marx and really Lenin, though some have kind of branched off from it a bit and created their own versions of communism. So what are the differences between capitalism, socialism, and communism? Well, Marx saw it as kind of a progression, starting from capitalism, and then you move through socialism and eventually ending with communism, which he saw as kind of a utopian or perfect society. Marx viewed capitalism as having a fatal flaw. Because under capitalism you have private property, eventually someone will start accumulating more private property, more capital, and that can be anything. It can be land, it can be businesses, it can be money, and someone will start accumulating more than other people. And those people who don't have as much capital will then end up having to work for those who do own the capital. And the owners of the capital can make their workers work for very low wages. So it's really, he saw that there was this fundamental struggle between the owners of capital, those who own more capital, and the workers, those who own less capital. And any excess profits will go to the owner of the capital, not to the workers. And the workers won't be able to demand higher wages because there are so many workers relative to the owners of capital. There will be a lot of competition for jobs, and the owners can then end up paying people as little as they want. Now, as we've seen when we discussed the late 19th century, this is sort of what was happening at the time. There were the captains of industry or the robber barons, depending upon how you saw them. They were accumulating enormous amounts of capital, And there were lots of very low paid laborers who couldn't accumulate enough capital to improve their lives. And this was happening in Europe as well as in America. So Marx is just basing his ideas on what he sees going on around him. He's arguing that the owners of capital will just continue to accumulate more capital, and they will keep the profits for themselves rather than, and they will continue to pay their workers low wages, because why wouldn't they? They have no incentive to pay their workers higher wages. Marx never really considers a reality where the owners might want to pay their workers a decent wage, probably because he didn't really see anybody doing that at the time. So individual workers would not have much leverage relative to the owners, and so they would never be able to achieve economic justice unless, Marx argued, they began to organize. The workers begin to organize, and they would come together and demand that the owners pay them higher wages or better their working conditions. So hence unionization. And here we are starting to move along the spectrum towards socialism. So the other thing about capitalism that Marx objected to was that it allowed for very high concentration of wealth in the hands of a small few, and that wealth could then be passed down from generation to generation. Marx argued that this was a problem because eventually the guy who has done all the hard work and put in all the effort accumulating all of that wealth is no longer the owner of that wealth. He's going to die someday, and he's going to pass his fortune on to his children and his grandchildren. And they have done nothing to merit being given all of this wealth and all the power that comes along with it. They might be utter idiots, but they're the ones in control now, and everyone else just has to bow down and work for them. Again, this is largely the reality that Marx found himself living in the late 19th century. And especially in Europe. This was especially true in Europe, where you had landed titles and aristocracy. There were these incompetent, extravagantly living nobility, and lots of very unhappy peasants. And this is a recipe for revolution. So Marx argued that all of that accumulated wealth should be redistributed on a more equal basis. Again, we're moving more towards socialism here. Under a socialist economy, the government takes a larger role in the economy. It regulates the economy. And one of the things that the government does is redistribute the wealth. The government also starts assuming more control over some important industries that provide services to the public, things like transportation, utilities. All these kind of things that are necessary for public life. Marx argued that capitalism is inherently unstable, and that eventually because you have this fundamental struggle between the owners of capital and the workers, that's eventually going to result in the working class overthrowing the ownership class and assuming the power for themselves. So he theorizes that eventually capitalism will give way to socialism, and then eventually a classless society will result. And the state, as he put it, wither away. And he doesn't really explain how we're going to get there in concrete terms, but he kind of has these theories. So he believes that there will eventually be a revolution, that the capitalists will be overthrown, and that there will be an establishment of a classless and stateless society. So Marx's ideas were very, very popular among a lot of people in the late 19th and early 20th century, probably because what he was describing was a very utopian society. It was a nice idea to think that someday we might get to a world where everyone is equal, where everyone is sharing the wealth and the resources, and everyone can do what they found most meaningful and fulfilling to them. It's kind of a Star Trek sort of world in the sense where, they don't really have money. You don't have to, work really. You only work at what you want to do. So, it's this very kind of, utopian society. Of course, Marx believed that a lot of struggle was necessary in order to get to that point. And he is in favor of the working classes actively trying to overthrow the ownership classes through revolution. So this is why his ideas are so threatening to the elite or the ruling class, because, obviously they don't want to be overthrown. And it's Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks who are the ones who first try to put the ideas of Marx into practice in the real world. So in 1918, after the Tsar is overthrown in Russia, which is a classic case of a society where you have a small group of aristocrats who are holding all the wealth and power, and the people end up rising up against the nobility. So after that happens, the Bolsheviks eventually assume power. And now they have to actually run a government based on Marx's ideas. So under Lenin's leadership, the Bolsheviks created a single-party system that is supposed to shepherd the nation toward the eventual communist utopian state. So most nations under communism have one-party rule, have a single party that is supposed to represent all of the people. Now, of course, the problem here is that with only one party in charge of everything, how do you know that the party is really representing the people? There are no checks and balances in a communist system, so it invites a certain amount of corruption. And it's very difficult to do anything about it if it is corrupt, because if there is nothing short of total government overthrow that can oust those corrupt elements from power. So this is what is the creation of what becomes known as kind of a Marxist-Leninist philosophy. And most communist countries operate under this sort of combination Marxist-Leninist ideal. Now, one thing about communism that can be confusing is that it is both an economic system and a political system. So we have to consider also kind of a political spectrum here. We have to consider, sort of the differences between authoritarianism and democracy when we're thinking about why the U.S. and the Soviet Union become so diametrically opposed. So the U.S., I would put somewhere right about here, sort of somewhere in the vein of kind of, close to democracy. We obviously aren't a, true democracy. We're a representative democracy. And we're somewhere in between capitalism and socialism. We are not entirely socialist, obviously. We don't have government owning the banks. Government doesn't own the railroads. Government doesn't own the transportation systems and all those sort of things. But we do have unions. We do have a social safety net. We do have the government regulating the economy in certain aspects. So we are somewhere in between capitalism and socialism. And we are definitely more on the side of democracy than we are authoritarianism. The Soviet Union is more close to authoritarianism and communism. Obviously, they were one-party rule. That's the authoritarianism, even if it's ruled by a party and not necessarily ruled by an individual. Although they did have strong men who were at the head of the party. And they're definitely more on the side of communism, the government, kind of owning everything and redistributing wealth and, kind of controlling the economy very, very tightly. So if we look at that, we can kind of see why Americans and Russians might find themselves in opposition. They are kind of at polar opposites almost, not completely, but almost at polar opposites of the economic spectrum and the political spectrum. Now, of course, the Cold War is about more than just a clash of ideology. It's about two superpowers vying for dominance in the international system. Marx originally argued that capitalist nations, in their struggle for gaining imperial power, that they would eventually destroy each other and leave the door open for communism to flourish. And obviously, this was not the future that America, as a capitalist nation, wanted to see come to reality. As we discussed last time, the U.S. and the Soviet Union have very different visions for the post-war world, and these visions are what is going to eventually lead directly to the Cold War. So that brings us into what does Europe look like after World War II? America's biggest problem at the end of World War II is Eastern Europe. The Soviet Red Army is in occupation, is in control of all of the areas in yellow here. And this is directly challenging those Atlantic Charter principles for which we had theoretically been fighting. America is trying to extend its economic and political influence around the globe, and the Soviet Union is kind of threatening that. The Soviet Union is in possession of most of Eastern Europe at this point. So the question is, how is the U.S. going to respond? The first clash comes over the country of Poland. For the Soviets, Poland was important because it was a buffer area between Russia and Germany. And the U.S. The Soviet Union wants a friendly Poland to allow the Soviets to exert control over Germany. For the U.S. and for Britain, Poland is kind of important symbolically because, of course, it was Hitler's invasion of Poland that had sparked World War II, and it's important politically. There's a very large Polish-American community in the United States, and they wield some influence. So the Yalta Agreement, the agreement at the Yalta Conference that was supposed to settle the question of the Polish government, but it was very vague, and the situation was still kind of unresolved when Truman takes office. So Truman's advisors, he inherited a lot of advisors from Roosevelt, and they were very hard line against the Soviet Union. And they were talked about that the U.S. was facing a barbarian invasion of Europe, and that unless the Soviets would be checked, they would, kind of basically overrun all of Europe. And Truman agrees to this. He says, we must stand up to the Russians and not be easy with them. And so this new stance becomes very clear in April of 1945 when the Soviet foreign minister meets with Truman. He meets to talk with him about the issue of Poland. And Truman is concerned that the Russians are breaking the Yalta agreements, even though these agreements were very, very vague to begin with. And so Truman demands that a democratic government be set up in Poland, and he insists that the Russians agree to this. And when Molotov protests, he says, I've never been talked to like that in my life. Truman responds, carry out your agreements and you won't get talked to like that. So obviously there are tensions escalating. The relationship between the U.S. and the Soviet Union is deteriorating. Stalin rejects Truman's demand. He says it's contrary to what they had agreed upon at Yalta. And Truman eventually accepts a compromise, and Stalin includes some pro-Westerners in the new Polish government that gets set up. So this is really kind of the first warning shots or shots fired in the Cold War come over the issue of Eastern Europe and specifically Poland. Now, the Cold War at this point is largely a war of rhetoric. It's really Stalin who is the first to declare the existence of a fundamental struggle between communism and capitalism. He says that eventually the capitalist world would self-destruct. He talks about the Soviets preparing themselves to ensure their own survival in this very hostile world. And this is viewed by the U.S. as kind of a declaration of war. So this happens on February 9th, 1946. Stalin says, he's very confident that eventually the Russian system is going to triumph, the capitalism is going to self-destruct, and that the Soviets have to, defend themselves, basically. So he gives this speech, and the response to his speech comes not from the Americans, but from Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill had long been very suspicious of the Soviets. And so he gives a speech. He comes to the United States on this sort of tour, and he gives a speech in Fulton, Missouri. And Truman is there behind him on the dais, and Churchill argues for the need of English-speaking peoples to organize themselves in opposition to what he calls an iron curtain descending across the continent. So it's Churchill who first uses this phrase, the iron curtain. And essentially, where Churchill is proposing here that the Europeans or the English and Americans unite, that they unite outside of the United Nations to protect Europe from this Soviet threat. And the Soviets perceive this as kind of a direct challenge to their power in Eastern Europe. Now, this brings us to, we're still thinking about, sort of ideas and, sort of the rhetoric that's being used in the Cold War. And this brings us to a individual known as George Kennan. He was a key American diplomat, and he was an expert on Russia. And he was educated at Princeton University. He joined the Foreign Service after college. By the mid-1930s, he's part of this core of very professionally trained Russian experts on the staff of the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. So he had a, sort of deep, intimate knowledge of Russia and Russian people. And he was part of this group of officials who believed that there wasn't very much basis for cooperation with the Soviet Union, even against potential adversaries. So he actually serves as the deputy head of the U.S. mission in Moscow from July 1944 to April of 1946. And it's during the time when he's serving in this mission that he sends a telegram to the State Department. And this is a famous telegram known as the Long Telegram. And so it's called the Long Telegram because it was really, really long. And so he sends this note or this telegram to the State Department, basically talking about the current state of affairs between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. And he talks in the telegram about the hostility that has developed and why it has developed. And he says that the hostility stems from what he calls the Kremlin's neurotic view of world affairs. And he says that in turn, that stems from the traditional and instinctive Russian sense of insecurity. He says it's no accident that Marxism took root in Russia first. He says only in this land could a doctrine thrive which viewed economic conflicts of society as insoluble by peaceful means. And so he says that Russia is this political force. The Soviet Union is this political force that is committed to destroying the American way of life in order to assure its own security. And that the fact that the Soviets are taking this very rigid stance is not so much a response to American actions as more a reflection of Stalin's efforts to maintain his autocratic rule. So because of this, Kennan argues that we cannot accommodate the Soviet Union, that the Russians have to be opposed at every turn. And so this is a very influential telegram. And I think it's interesting because he calls the Soviet Union neurotic. He's essentially saying that, hey, these people are crazy here, and we can't deal with them. We just have to oppose them. So this dispatch that he sends brings Kennan to the attention of the Secretary of the Navy, James Forrestal. And Forrestal was one of kind of the leading hardliners in Truman's cabinet. And so then he gets Kennan assigned to this influential position in the State Department, and he encourages him to publish an article in the influential Foreign Affairs Journal. And he publishes this article under the pseudonym Mr. X. And you can actually read excerpts from this on page 245 in For the Record. So essentially, this is kind of an extension of the Long Telegram. He talks about, that we can't coexist with the Soviet Union. He says that the main element of any United States policy toward the Soviet Union must be a long-term, patient, but firm and vigilant containment of Russian expansive tendencies. And so he says that the Soviets are putting pressure against the Western world, and that this can be contained, but only if we are vigilant about it. And this is going to essentially serve as the guideline for U.S. conduct in the Cold War for the next several decades, this idea of containing the Soviet Union, containing the spread of communism. So this brings us to the Truman Doctrine. And a little bit of background on how we get to this point. So in February 21st, 1947, the British come to the United States and they inform the Americans that they can no longer provide military and economic support to Greece and Turkey. By this time, Greece had fallen into a civil war between the monarchists, those who wanted to maintain the Greek monarchy, and the National Liberation Front, which was a communist group. Stalin was not directly involved with the communists in Greece, but they did receive support from Yugoslavia, which at this point had also become communist. Meanwhile, the Soviets were pressuring Turkey for control of a very important region called the Dardanelles. It's the passage between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. And so Americans had already begun sending aid to this region, but without the British support there, they were really afraid that Greece and Turkey would be unable to withstand this pressure and that they would fall to communism. So the State Department quickly develops a plan. They're going to increase American assistance for Greece and Turkey, but the administration has to then figure out how it's going to persuade Congress that our national interest is involved in what's going on in Greece and Turkey. The Republicans had gained control of Congress in the previous year, and they wanted smaller budgets, and they wanted tax cuts rather than sending massive amounts of money overseas. So Truman needs to get bipartisan support. So he contacts Senator Arthur Vandenberg of Michigan, and he and Truman kind of work this plan out. And Vandenberg says that Truman needed to scare the hell out of the country to gain support for this aid plan. So Truman takes this advice to heart, and he goes before Congress and he gives a speech, and he talks about what's going on in Greece and Turkey. And he says that it's not, just what's going on in Greece, but it's this threat to the Western vision of world that's posed by the Soviet Union. And you can read the Truman Doctrine speech in your document reader. He says here that every nation must choose between alternative ways of life. He argues that the seeds of totalitarian regimes are nurtured by misery and want. And he says they spread and they grow in this evil soil of poverty and strife. They reach their full growth when the hope of a people for a better life has died. We must keep that hope alive. If we falter in our leadership, we may endanger the peace of the world, and we shall surely endanger the welfare of this nation. So this is when we get kind of the first major application of the containment policy. Truman is trying to persuade Congress to approve his plan for economic aid to Greece and Turkey. And so he says it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting subjugation. Now, Truman's speech is specifically referring to the situation that's going on in Greece and Turkey, but the Truman Doctrine is much, much broader than that. And the attention on containing communism begins to soon shift to Western Europe. So the Truman Doctrine had talked about how the seeds of totalitarianism are nurtured by misery and want, and this seemed to be nowhere more evident than in Europe. Europe is very economically and politically unstable in the wake of World War II. Obviously, their economies of places like Britain and France and Belgium and the Netherlands and Italy, all of these economies are, sort of basically destroyed. And in the, kind of vacuum of that, communist parties are growing stronger. Americans are afraid that the Russians are going to kind of seize this opportunity to intervene and exert their influence. So the economic reconstruction of Europe in general, and of Germany in particular, Germany is kind of the linchpin here, was very integral to this policy of containment. The new Secretary of State, George Marshall, he says, he put it, sort of in a rather apt metaphor. He said, the patient is sinking while the doctors deliberate. So the patient being Europe and the doctors being the United States. So we had to intervene. Our patient is dying here. And of course, Americans we're trying to shore up the instability in Europe. We're trying to prevent communism from gaining a foothold. We're also trying to provide markets for American goods. Americans are interested in boosting the European economy to provide places for us to export American products. And there was this imbalance in the economy. In the aftermath of World War II, the Europeans are not able to purchase as many American goods. The U.S., of course, is producing massive amounts. So there's this imbalance, and that's starting to threaten the American economy as well. So on June 5th, 1947, Marshall gives a speech at Harvard University, and he outlines his plan. He basically says all European nations should draw up an aid program that the U.S. can support. And he claims that all European nations are going to be willing to, or we're going to be willing to have all European nations participate in this, that even Soviet bloc countries would be welcome to participate. Now, in reality, the State Department had made Soviet participation very unlikely because it demanded, part of this, aid with the Marshall Plan demanded that each nation should make itself open to economic investigation. And they knew the Soviets weren't going to go for that. And no one really wanted the Russians to participate because it would make the program too costly and it would eliminate any hope of it being accepted by this Republican-dominated Congress. When the request for aid to Europe was finally hammered out, American officials ended up lowering the amount that was requested, but they agreed to provide $17 billion over a period of 4 years to 16 cooperating nations. So this is a very integral part of the early Cold War, because essentially what we're doing here is we're trying to shore up Western Europe to prevent the spread of communism, to contain it. And this directly leads us into what's going on in Germany. So at the Potsdam Conference in July of 1945, the four major powers had agreed to divide Germany up into 4 zones. And Americans had a pretty good reason to prefer a divided Germany. First of all, a divided Germany would be a weak Germany. It would prevent Germany from rising again as a threat. Secondly, the military authorities wanted to make sure that they had the power to run things as they saw fit in the American zone. They didn't want to have to deal with having a 4-power regime over a united Germany. And they didn't want the Russians to have influence over West Germany. This division was not seen as being kind of an ideal situation, but it wasn't seen as catastrophic either. So essentially, the policy was to let each side do what it wanted in its own part of Germany. And Stalin agrees to this because the American proposal is kind of essentially in his own line of thinking, too. He doesn't want Germany to be united either. The Russians are afraid of a remilitarized Germany, but both sides quickly realize that it's in their interest to redevelop their own zone. And at Potsdam, they agreed that the German economy would be managed separately. So Germany becomes kind of this focal point. Once you get to the policy of containment, this new focus on containment, it affects the policy on Germany and on Europe more generally. So by late 1946, the Americans and the British have merged their zones in Germany for economic purposes. And they have started turning things back over to Germans, started assigning administrative duties to Germans, and started, sort of rebuilding Western Germany. And U.S. is trying to make Germany a strong kind of country in order to anchor Europe. Our idea is we want, sort of this really strong Germany in order to, keep communism from spreading, basically. The Soviets are very unhappy about this Marshall Plan. They're very unhappy about the revitalization of Western Germany, and the Cold War escalates yet again. So on June 24th, 1948, the Soviets stop all ground transportation between the city of Berlin, which, as you can see, is in the middle of East Germany, and the Soviet zone, and the western zones of Germany. So now no longer can any transportation no ground transportation into East Germany from the west. They are responding to this American policy of reconstructing this unified West Germany. And the Soviets want to have kind of a weakened, non-Western Central Europe at this point. And so that's being threatened by this revitalized Western Germany. And so they're very much worried. As you can see, the city of Berlin itself was divided into 4 zones. You have West Berlin and East Berlin. So you got this sort of enclave in the middle of East Germany, in the middle of the Soviet-controlled zone of Germany, that is a Western enclave, and that's very threatening to the Soviets. So they are trying to force the other nations to get out of Berlin. The U.S. and Britain immediately begin airlifting supplies into West Berlin. And this operation delivered more than 2 million tons of supplies. They end up breaking the Russian blockade in less than a year. And the U.S. kind of pitches this as a sort of a triumph of American power and ingenuity. We gain the goodwill of the people of Berlin. Obviously, they're very happy to have, American supplies and goods. So the Berlin airlift, after the Berlin airlift, this division between Western Germany and Eastern Germany kind of settles into what everybody realizes is probably permanent, at least for the foreseeable future. By May of 1949, the British and the Americans and the French have all merged their zones into one country, the Federal Republic of Germany, which becomes popularly known as West Germany. And everyone basically agrees that even though it would have been nice to have reunification, it's now best to, sort of at least keep West Germany out of the Soviets' hands. West Germany really needs the help of the U.S. to get its economy going again, and the U.S. wants to create a very strong West Germany to anchor the rest of Europe. Now that the Western zones are merged, Stalin has to authorize the formation of a separate German Democratic Republic, or popularly known as East Germany. Of course, East Germany was neither democratic nor a republic, at least not in the American conception of those terms. West Germany contained most of Germany's industrial centers and resources. East Germany had traditionally been an agricultural region, and the industry that had been there had been basically taken by the Soviets in reparations after the war. So the country has to set about creating an industrial base almost from scratch. And they embark on this program of rapid industrialization, which is incredibly hard on the East German economy and its people. And so we start to see thousands of East Germans begin to emigrate to West Germany via Berlin. Berlin remains a divided city, but it's still open at this point. So the Cold War, basically, because of this, you have Germany's leading city, Berlin, divided between East and West, yet surrounded on all sides by communist East Germany and the Soviet Red Army. So West Berlin soon becomes kind of this permanent advertisement for all the virtues of capitalism and democracy, and yet it's very vulnerable because at any time the Soviets or the East Germans could cut it off in another blockade. East Germany has its own problems, though, because the border between East and West Berlin is still open, and East Germans can travel easily to the western half of the city and enjoy the good life. And so by the 1960s, you have nearly 3 million East Germans had gone to the West. And so they're getting this massive, sort of population drain, and it's mostly higher educated and skilled workers who are leaving. And so this becomes a big problem for the East Germans, and it's going to lead later to the creation of the Berlin Wall in the 1960s. And this will become the kind of most tangible physical symbol of the Cold War. So this brings us to 1949. 1949, two major developments. You have October 1st, 1949, Mao Zedong officially proclaims the founding of the People's Republic of China. And this is a serious, serious blow to the policy of containment. The Truman administration is accused of having lost China. They respond by refusing to recognize the new communist government. They prevent the Chinese from joining the United Nations. We wouldn't officially recognize China as a country until the 1970s. And then we also have, on September 22nd, 1949, Truman announces that Russia has exploded an atomic device. And this is a, sort of major news here. It's no longer, the U.S. no longer has a monopoly over atomic weapons. A lot of people, very few American officials, despite repeated warnings from the scientific community, very few had expected the Soviets would get the bomb so soon. And this is occurring kind of simultaneously with the fall of China to communism. And so this kind of hardens America's diplomatic attitudes. Truman orders the acceleration of the development of a new hydrogen bomb. We have, military authorities are proposing the rearmament of Germany. We see in the wake of this a dramatic increase in American military spending. So the Cold War is really escalating here. And part of this we see in this very influential document known as NSC 68. NSC 68 is a top secret report that's prepared by the State Department, and it's issued on April 7th, 1950. And it was mostly written by a guy named Paul Nitze. He was the head of a policy planning committee in the State Department. And it's one of the most influential documents of the entire Cold War. Basically, NSC 68 embraces the idea that now we have, this international distribution of power has been fundamentally altered. We have the U.S. and the Soviet Union at odds. They are now these two hegemonic powers competing against each other. And in NSC 68, they argue that the Soviets are different from previous hegemonic powers because they are trying to impose their authority over the rest of the world. It says conflict has therefore become endemic. Every individual faces the ever-present possibility of annihilation should the conflict enter the phase of total war, because now both sides have nuclear weapons. So this is, sort of a fundamental reality that we have to face, that NSC 68 is arguing. So they argue, Nitze and the other State Department officials who draw up this document argue that the U.S. can no longer rely on other countries to take the initiative in resisting communism, that the U.S. has to establish itself as the leader of the non-communist world, and to do this, America needs superior overall power, and that means military strength. The Soviets are trying to bring us down by any means necessary, and we're also seeking to build up overwhelming military power, including atomic weapons. And so to counter this, we have to build up our own military power. We have to enlist the free world in this, in resisting the Soviet Union. Initially, a number of U.S. officials are opposed to what NSC 68 is arguing here. Even George Kennan, he argues that the U.S. already has a substantial military advantage over the Soviet Union, that we don't necessarily need to make this massive military buildup. And he disagrees with the idea that the United States can contain the Soviet Union through, just military might alone. He says, we have to use political and economic measures as well. But what happens is that NSC 68 kind of becomes a fixed reality when you have the invasion of South Korea by Soviet and Chinese-backed North Korean forces in June of 1950. And this is kind of the event, event that makes NSC 68's recommendations official policy. And so we see the U.S. government start to begin to build up a massive, massive military force. So this leads us into what happens with Korea. And we have to talk a little bit about the roots of the war in Korea here. And this, you can see this is a map of Korea, and it gives you some of the sense of what we're dealing with here. At the end of World War II, Korea had been divided along the 38th parallel, which is that sort of line right in the middle of the map there. And basically what we had done was, divide up Korea between a, sort of Soviet-backed government, the communist government of Kim Il-sung, and the American-backed government of South Korea under a man named Syngman Rhee. So in December of 1945, Korea gets divided along the 38th parallel. It's supposed to be a temporary thing. It's supposed to be, last no more than 5 years. And the U.S., though, is very suspicious of what's going on with the Soviet Union. The U.S. sees the fact that the Soviet Union is kind of controlling and dominating North Korea as part of this Soviet master plan to eventually gain control over South Korea as well. Korea is getting to be more important to the American global policy as part of a strategy of containment. And also, we're trying to revive the Japanese economy as well, so we need Korea. We want to connect the Korean economy to the Japanese economy. And so we want to establish a democratic regime in South Korea. Now, as far as North Korea is concerned, it was never simply a Soviet satellite. Kim Il-sung was not a Soviet puppet, but he, very much used the support of the Soviets to establish his leadership. So what we're seeing, we start to see a lot of political turmoil in the South. We start to see kind of protests among the rural peasant population, and this escalates into open warfare in the South Korea by late 1948. And the Americans are assuming that the North Koreans and the Soviets are behind all of this. And soon we start to see conflict spread to the region of the border. And this, we start to see this, organized guerrilla warfare beginning. The conflict spreads to the region of the border. And, you have northern and southern troops kind of fighting skirmishes against each other. Both Kim Il-sung and Syngman Rhee, they both want to unify their country by force. And Kim Il-sung actually goes to the Soviet Union in February of 1949, and he gets some aid and help from Stalin. Meanwhile, the South is getting more than $100 million per year from the Americans. So both sides are kind of waiting for each other to make a move. So this finally happens on June 25th, 1950. North Korean forces invade South Korea. It's still somewhat unclear what actually happened and what role the Soviet Union or the China might have played in this attack of the North Koreans on South Korea. But we were taken by surprise. This is a kind of a surprise attack, and so conflict is breaking out, and we have to decide what to do. Now, Truman and his Secretary of State, they assume that this invasion is being directed by the Soviet Union. And so they call the United Nations, they call a session of the United Nations Security Council to pass a resolution. The Soviet Union is, at the time, not represented on the Security Council because they are boycotting it to protest the exclusion of communist China. So we are able to pass this resolution in the United Nations because we don't have the threat of a veto by the Soviet Union. So we pass this resolution. It's supposed to be this joint resolution, sort of declaring that we will oppose the, invasion of South Korea. 2 days later, Truman orders American air and naval units into action. And the day after he orders American units into combat, the president goes to Congress and he informs them of it. And he calls it a police action so that he's not going to have to get a formal declaration of war. And he doesn't get a lot of opposition from Congress on this matter. So the Korean War is never actually a war. It's only officially a police action. By mid-July, General MacArthur, who's the leader of the American troops in Korea, he had been able to halt the advance of the North Koreans. The question now is whether to begin to push them back beyond the 38th parallel to try to reunite the country. And so they decide, yes, we're going to do this. So MacArthur lands at the port of Incheon, which is in North Korea, in September. Truman gives him the permission to cross the 38th parallel. And the aim is to create a unified, independent, democratic Korea. So now, interestingly enough, we are moving beyond simply containment. We're not simply trying to contain the spread of communism here. Now we're envisioning a rollback of communist power. U.S. policymakers didn't really believe that Russia would respond to this, and we weren't even really very concerned about China either. But we underestimated the Chinese desire to maintain their national security and to maintain their connection with Stalin. And if you look at documents that have been declassified from the Soviet and Chinese archives from this period, it now reveals that Stalin had actually encouraged the Chinese to attack. He wasn't willing to provide actual support to Chinese troops, but he had, given his kind of blessing for it. So MacArthur continues to push northward into North Korea. In late November, the Chinese invade. They invade en masse. They push the Americans back below the 38th parallel in just a matter of about 3 weeks. By March of 1951, the Americans had regained most of that lost territory. They'd pushed the Chinese and the North Koreans back across the 38th parallel. And now the war kind of degenerates into this protracted stalemate. 4/5 of the American casualties in the Korean War occurred after the UN forces crossed the 38th parallel. And so the war kind of freezes the U.S. into this Cold War posture, and it destroys any kind of relationship that the U.S. might have had with China. This stalemate, as it keeps kind of going on and on and on for months and months, it provokes a struggle between General MacArthur and President Truman over what kind of war the U.S. is fighting. Eventually, as the war is kind of dragging on and on and on, and nothing is happening, the U.S. U.S. officials are starting to kind of cautiously explore the possibility of maybe we can start sitting down with the North Koreans and talking to them. MacArthur, however, he issues a public statement calling for Chinese surrender, and he actually proposes escalating the war and possibly even attacking China. And so Truman is this will not stand with Truman. He is not going to be, kind of upstaged by this general, and so he fires MacArthur. But MacArthur had the American public's support. He was a decorated general, and the public really preferred his idea of a quick victory over Truman's idea of trying to keep the war very limited. And MacArthur, after he's fired, he says that the Truman administration doesn't have any plan for the war. And if you look at polls from the era, the Gallup polls revealed that 69% of the American public supported MacArthur. He was greeted with wild enthusiasm when he returns to the United States in 1951. The Korean War boosts the American economy because obviously you saw all these new government funds pouring in, but it's a time of rising insecurity about America's position in the world. It's this increasingly intensified anxiety about communism, which we're going to get to in just a bit. And as the war drags on, as the casualties begin to mount, eventually 140,000 American dead and wounded, the public becomes very frustrated. The U.S. is the most powerful nation in the world, and yet we seem to be incapable of winning this minor skirmish in this tiny little country on the other side of the world. And so many people began to believe that something is seriously wrong. And so the Truman administration, they had been criticized for letting China fall to the communists. Some even concluded, as we're going to see, that communist sympathizers in the State Department were responsible for this. And even though the administration tries to explain their policy, why they were unable to prevent China from becoming communist, this doesn't appease the critics of the administration. So the Korean War is very, very unpopular. And the fact that Truman, sort of is kind of owning this war, he dismisses MacArthur, who is so popular. It makes Truman so unpopular that he decides he's not going to seek re-election, even though he could have theoretically run for a third term. He had served most of FDR's fourth term, and he had, then been reelected in 1948, but he decides in 1952 that he is not going to run again. Now, at the same time all of this is happening, we also are seeing an escalation of the arms race. As I mentioned, NSC 68 calls for, sort of rapid expansion of the military, and especially, sort of the creation of a nuclear arsenal. And so we have the development of the hydrogen bomb. This is sparked by the Soviets announcing that they have, developed their own atomic weapon in the fall of 1949. So now we no longer have a monopoly over nuclear weapons. Most American nuclear scientists are against us developing a hydrogen bomb, but one particularly influential scientist, a guy named Edward Teller, he had been wanting to attempt to build a thermonuclear device ever since, even before the atomic bomb had been created. And he is facing a lot of opposition over, from other physicists, primarily from the so-called father of the atomic bomb, J. Robert Oppenheimer. Once he kind of, sort of is able to kind of put down that opposition, he now has the chance to proceed. He now, sort of is able to kind of build this bomb that he had wanted to build for so long. So by March of 1952, we have the first successful thermonuclear test. It's highly classified. We test this bomb in the middle of the South Pacific in March of 1952. Rumors circulate that it created a hole in the ocean floor, 175 feet deep. Essentially, a hydrogen bomb works by detonating a regular atomic bomb, a fission bomb, in a special compartment right next to fusion fuel. And the gamma and the X-rays of the fission reaction are able to start this fusion reaction. And so thermonuclear weapons are much, much more powerful than standard atomic weapons. They have an almost unlimited yield of power. The largest one that was ever developed was actually developed by the Soviet Union. It had a yield of 50 million tons of TNT. The Soviets announced pretty quickly after our own successful test, the Soviets announced that they have now developed a hydrogen bomb. And so now, sort of we have this definite arms race going on. Now, so this brings us to the end of the early Cold War period. In 1952, a new president is elected, Eisenhower. He is going to continue to fight the Cold War. In 1953, we have a new leader of the Soviet Union in power, Nikita Khrushchev. And he is also going to continue to fight the Cold War, but he's going to denounce a lot of the violent tactics of Stalin. He kind of brings in a less repressive era in the Soviet Union internally. We're going to continue to talk about the foreign policy of the Cold War in the coming weeks as the conflict evolves over time. But this kind of brings us to the effect of the Cold War upon American society. And as you can see, I really love this picture. This is a group of American citizens, and you can see in the background there is a mushroom cloud kind of in the background. This is a group of American citizens in Las Vegas, Nevada. And they are witnessing, pretty far off a nuclear test. And so this kind of gives a good sense of how, American society responded to living in a nuclear age, and also, sort of how the Cold War affected American society. Now, to understand this, we also have to kind of go back a little bit, because we have to look at the roots of anti-communism here. Anti-communism in America is very often associated with the 1940s, the 1950s, and McCarthyism, but it actually has its roots going back much, much earlier. It really goes all the way back to 1917 with the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, but you can see the roots of it even in the late 19th century. We talked about all the fears of radical European immigrants bringing socialist and anarchist ideas into the United States. Now, after World War I, communism is kind of a concrete reality, and we see the first real manifestation of these fears of anarchy and fears of communism with the Red Scare of 1919 and 1920. This is this short but very intense period of political intolerance that is inspired by a wave of labor strikes after the war and kind of the social tensions and fears that are generated by the Russian Revolution. The Attorney General, a man named A. Mitchell Palmer, he was convinced that all of these labor strikes that immediately followed the end of World War I were part of this worldwide communist conspiracy. And so he sends out his agents to raid the offices of labor organizations and radical groups throughout the country. These raids, known as the Palmer raids, were actually presided over by a young J. Edgar Hoover, who would, of course, continue to pursue communists when he later, by the 1940s, becomes the head of the FBI. More than 5,000 people are arrested in the Palmer raids. Most of them were held for months without being charged of anything. Hundreds of immigrants are deported because of them. Palmer is kind of heavily criticized for his severity of his abuses of civil liberties. He's criticized at the time, but the damage was done. And the raids were kind of a pretty big setback for labor unions and radical organizations. And they foster this idea that being a patriotic American means supporting the political and economic status quo and conformity. And these ideas, as we're going to see, really resurface in the 1940s and 1950s. Now, throughout the 1920s and especially into the 1930s, there is a small but very active Communist Party in the United States. And a lot of Americans, especially in the 1930s, many Americans on the left side of the political spectrum, who were not communists, but who may have worked with or socialized with communists for some of their shared goals. In the 1930s, communists in America were involved in a lot of different activities, including demonstrations of the unemployed. They were part of the labor union struggle. Many were very committed as well to the fight for the civil rights of African Americans. Communists were very supportive of FDR's New Deal. They worked to promote social change, this idea of kind of a diverse, pluralistic America. But there's also strong pushback against communists and radicals that begins in the 1930s. In 1938, the House of Representatives establishes an Un-American Activities Committee to investigate disloyalty. And of course, this committee is going to play a major role in the anti-communism of the 1940s and 1950s. And I think it's interesting to kind of think about that name for a minute. Un-American Activities. How are they defining un-American? Basically, it means it includes communists, labor radicals, anybody on the left of the political spectrum is now un-American. And in 1940, Congress passes the Smith Act, which makes it a federal crime to teach, advocate, or encourage the overthrow of the government. And you start to see states also beginning to investigate possible subversives as well here. So we can see that the roots of anti-communism in America go back to pretty far before the Cold War. It's not the Cold War that necessarily causes anti-communism. It's just really a symptom of it. The Cold War, of course, greatly heightens the anti-communism that already exists in America, and it ultimately takes it far beyond anything that had been seen before. Because the Cold War was an ideological struggle, it seemed to matter very greatly on what your political views were and which side you were on. Were you on the side of the U.S. or on the side of the Soviet Union? So we have all of this rhetoric of, government officials, American officials during the Cold War talk about, sort of the world is divided between free world and the enslaved world. You have liberty versus slavery of, sort of communism. And this automatically makes anybody who could be linked to communism the enemy of freedom. So anti-communism begins almost simultaneously with the advent of the Cold War itself. So in 1947, just after he announces the Truman Doctrine and he pledges America to fight against communism anywhere in the world, Truman establishes a loyalty review system for government employees. Anybody who was accused under this system had to somehow demonstrate that you were a patriotic American. And sometimes you weren't allowed to know who had accused you or why you had been accused. You just somehow had to kind of refute these charges. And several hundred people ended up being fired under this system, and many more end up resigning in protest rather than submit to investigation. So this starts to spread throughout the government. And then, of course, we have the famous House Un-American Activities Committee Hollywood hearings. And if you are kind of a cynical person, you might see this as, these congressmen on the House Un-American Activities Committee kind of wanting to get national publicity for themselves. And so they decide to call a bunch of famous celebrities to Washington to testify about potential communist influence in the motion picture industry. And a lot of very famous people testify that the movie industry did indeed harbor communists. And I'm going to show you guys a quick little video here that talks about it, gives some of the, sort of sense of what it was like during these hearings and, sort of how these hearings affected the people who were kind of caught up in them. So let's see if we can get this going here.
At home, Americans feared red subversion. Congress revived the House Committee on Un-American Activities. In 1947,
you can see Richard Nixon
the committee
is right
investigated Hollywood, factory of America's imagination.
Have you ever observed any communistic information in any scripts? Well, I have turned down quite a few scripts because I thought they were tinged with communistic ideas. They haven't attempted to use me, I don't think, because apparently they know that I'm not very sympathetic to communism.
There has been a small group within the Screen Actors Guild which has consistently opposed the policy of the Guild board and officers or the Guild itself as evidenced by the vote on various issues. That small clique has been referred to, has been discussed as more or less following the tactics that we associate with the Communist Party.
If I had my way about it, they'd all be sent back to Russia or some other unpleasant place.
10 witnesses, the Hollywood 10, defied the committee's right to ask about their beliefs.
Are you a member of the Communist Party? Or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?
It's unfortunate and tragic that I have to teach this committee the basic principles of Americanism.
That's not the question. The question is, have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?
I'm framing my answer in the only way in which any American citizen can frame his
Then you
answer to
denied-
a question
then
which
you-
invades his, absolutely invades
Then
his
you
right.
denied, you refused to answer that question. Is that correct?
I have told you that I will
All right.
offer my beliefs, my affiliations, and
Here's the
everything
witness.
else
Here's the
to the
witness.
American public, and they will know where I stand, as they do from what I have written.
Stand away
I
from
have
the
written
stand.
for Americanism for many years, and I shall
Stand
continue
away from the
to
stand.
fight for the Bill of Rights, which you are
Officer,
trying to
take
destroy.
this man away from the stand.
Others from the film industry demonstrated their support for the constitutional rights of the 10.
Are you or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?
I believe I have the right to be confronted with any evidence which supports this question. I should like to see what you have.
Oh, well, you would.
Yes.
Well, you will pretty soon. The witness is excused.
Either you completely cooperated with the committee, which meant saying yes or no to the question about whether you were a communist or ever had been, and if the answer was yes, as it was in my case, we knew the next question was who else was, and we certainly didn't want to go into that.
The 10 were imprisoned. With hundreds more, they were blacklisted, their livelihoods taken away.
People generally in Hollywood were pretty scared to have anything to do with us, whereas before we went to prison, they had not been nearly as scared, and there were plenty of undercover arrangements that were made to write scripts under pseudonyms for a good deal less money than you were accustomed to being paid. There were a couple of possible suicides as a result of it. There were a good deal of misery.
Americans feared that the enemy would take advantage of their freedoms, that agents of communism were undermining America.
All right, so that gives a little bit of a sense of what it was like to be living in America under this, kind of anti-communism kind of cloud. And of course, the name that most often gets associated with anti-communism during the Cold War is Joseph McCarthy. McCarthy was elected as a senator from Wisconsin in 1946, but he spent his first couple of years in the Senate not, doing too much. He was a popular speaker. He was a guest at, sort of cocktail parties in Washington, but his fellow senators didn't like him very much. He was difficult to work with. He had a pretty short temper. He was active in kind of labor issues. He had a reputation as kind of a moderate Republican. And he kind of catapults himself into the national spotlight in February of 1950 when he gives a speech before a Republican women's club in Wheeling, West Virginia. And in this speech, he states that the State Department is infested with communists, and he has a list of their names. And he then again gives the similar speech on the floor of the U.S. Congress. And you can read that speech. That's one of the documents that we'll be reading for our discussion board this week. He continues to use anti-communism to attack, all different areas of the federal government, including the Truman administration. So he, as you can see in this, sort of photo here, he's talking about, all these, sort of the organization of the Communist Party. He says that, all of these government agencies and things are being, infiltrated by the communists. He finally runs into trouble when he turns his investigatory gaze upon the Army. The Army is not having this. They kind of launch a counterattack on McCarthy. They accuse him of improperly pressuring the Army to give favorable treatment to a former aide of his. And so there are these dueling charges. McCarthy's arguing that the Army is infested with communists. The Army's saying, well, McCarthy has done this really unethical thing. So the Senate calls a subcommittee to kind of sort out these dueling charges. And the hearings of this subcommittee are nationally televised. They're called the Army-McCarthy hearings. And 20 million Americans tune in to see McCarthy badgering witnesses, making kind of these baseless charges. He kind of humiliates himself on national television. And in addition, this is, of course, when the famous line, sort of, "At long last, sir, have you no decency," sort of gets uttered. One of the nation's leading TV news anchors, Edward R. Murrow, he airs a number of television shows critical of McCarthy and kind of, taking him down systematically. And these two factors, Murrow's opposition, Murrow is very influential at the time, and kind of the televised Army-McCarthy hearings, they produce a major backlash against the senator, and he is subsequently censured by the Senate. He stays in the Senate for 2 more years, but his career is basically over at this point, and he dies later, likely from the effects of alcoholism. But his name lives on in the term McCarthyism, which has come to mean kind of reckless and unsubstantiated accusations and public attacks on the character or patriotism of your political opponents. So we see, sort of McCarthy kind of really, creating this atmosphere in America that is, sort of very fearful, very, sort of paranoid hysteria. And this is really reflected in the cartoon over here, which I talked about at the beginning of the module for this week. And this leads to, in large part, kind of the 1940s and 1950s being this era of kind of conformity. We think of the 1950s as kind of this era of conformity, and it's precisely because of the atmosphere of anti-communism that this happens. The two are very closely linked. It becomes very difficult for many Americans during the 1950s to voice any opinion that is in any way critical of the United States. And so many Americans, rather than face the consequences that might result from being labeled as disloyal, chose to keep silent, to conform, to get along, not rock the boat or make any waves. And you guys are going to be talking in the discussion this week over, what your thoughts are about, anti-communism. Was it justified in any way? Was the threat to American security and the American way of life, was it real or was it imagined? What were the consequences of anti-communism? How did it affect American society? How did it affect American culture? Thousands of people across the country lost their jobs. Some even went to prison or were expelled from organizations who wanted to, so-called purge their membership of suspected communists. Government agencies like the FBI greatly expanded their power during the communist period, the anti-communist period. McCarthy and others use anti-communism to attack their political opponents and to discredit the ideas of the New Deal. And so because of this, they're able to block a lot of the reforms that the Truman administration wanted to put forward, the fair deal that he tries to, get implemented. So the idea of expanding the New Deal welfare state, kind of continuing and expanding on that legacy that Roosevelt had left, that kind of ends up fading away. And the uses to which anti-communism were put were varied. It was a very useful tool that a lot of people could use. White supremacists used anti-communism to discredit the civil rights movement. Businesses used it against unions and labor reformers. Defenders of sexual morality and traditional gender roles called feminists or gay people communists and subversives. In particular, along with the Red Scare that we see in the 1950s, we have what's known as the Lavender Scare. This is the idea that if you were gay or lesbian or, bisexual, that, sort of you could somehow become compromised by the Soviets because, they would be able to, sort of hold that over you. And so a lot of people who were gay or lesbian or bisexual were actually, they ended up losing their jobs in government positions because of this. So this is what's known as the Lavender Scare. And it's, sort of a very real consequence for people of the LGBTQ community. So it's this incredibly versatile tool that can be used. And next week, we're going to be looking at kind of, the 1950s and American society in the 1950s. And we will see kind of how it's shaped by the Cold War and by kind of this overwhelming, sort of anti-communist hysteria that goes on. So I'm looking forward to discussing all of this with you guys this week in the discussion board. And I will see you guys all next week.